When you think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Knights in shining armor, majestic castles, and brutal torture devices. For money of US, the words medieval torture bring up terrifying images. The Iron Maiden, the Pair of Anguish, the rack. These devices have become symbols of a dark and cruel past, featured heavily in movies, TV shows, and even museums. But what if I told you that a lot of what we believe about medieval torture is actually a myth? Let's uncover the truth behind these infamous machines. Let's start with the most iconic one, the Iron Maiden. It's that human-shaped coffin lined with spikes, designed to slowly impale its victim. It sounds absolutely horrifying, right? Well, here is the shocker. There is zero evidence that the Iron Maiden was ever used as a torture device in the Middle Ages. The famous Nuremberg Maiden was actually built in the late 18th century, long after the medieval period ended. It was likely created as a gruesome curiosity, combining elements from different historical periods to create a chilling spectacle. Historians believe it was more of a macabre piece of art than a functional instrument of justice or injustice. So, while it's a staple of horror films, it's not a relic of medieval cruelty. What abode? The Pair of Anguish. This pear-shaped device was supposedly inserted into a victim's mouth or other orifices, and then expanded by turning a screw, causing unimaginable internal damage. It's another truly grotesque concept, but once again, history tells a different story. Most surviving examples of these pairs date from the 17th century or later. There are no medieval records that describe their use. Some experts even suggest they weren't torture devices at all, but rather shoe stretchers, glove wideners, or even sock stretchers that were later misidentified and sensationalized. The story was just too gruesome and fascinating for people to let go of. Okay, but what about the rack? Surely that one was real, right? Yes, the rack was a real and horrific torture device, but its use wasn't as widespread in the Middle Ages as you might think. It was primarily used during the later medieval period and became much more common during the religious conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Well into the early modern era, its purpose was usually to extract confessions, especially during heresy trials. So while the rack is historically accurate, lumping it in with a host of other fictional devices paints a misleading picture of everyday medieval justice. So where did all these myths come from? A lot of it has to do with the 18th and 19th centuries. During this time, there was a growing fascination with the Dark Ages. Reuters, and so-called historians of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, wanted to portray the medieval Catholic Church and feudal systems as barbaric and They exaggerated, and in some cases, completely invented stories of torture to make their own era seem more civilized and progressive. These stories were then picked up by museums in the 19th century, which created authentic replicas of these fictitious devices to attract thrill-seeking crowds. It was a business, and fear sold tickets. The truth is, medieval justice was complex. While it could be harsh, the most common punishments were things like fines, public shaming in the stocks or pillory, or exile. Torture was used, but it was often legally regulated, at least in theory, and not the free-for-all of creative cruelty that popular culture suggests. The image of every castle having a dungeon filled with fantastical torture machines is largely a fantasy. History is often more nuanced and less sensational than the stories we're told. The real horror isn't just in the devices that were used, but in how the truth can be twisted and exaggerated over time. Thanks for watching and joining me on this dive into history's myths. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. See you next time. Ever wondered what would happen if you were accused of a crime 1,000 years ago? Forget CSI and fingerprints. In the medieval world, justice was a completely different game. Without modern police forces or DNA evidence, how did they even begin to solve crimes? Well, it often came down to three things: what people said they saw, what you confessed to, and a whole lot of faith. Let's say your neighbor, Bartholomew, claims you stole his prize-winning pig. There are no security cameras, no forensic team to dust for prints. The local authorities, probably a lord or a magistrate, would first look for witnesses. Did anyone see you near the pigsty? Did anyone hear you talk about wanting a pig? Witness testimony was huge, but it was also messy. People could lie, misremember, or have their own grudges. If witnesses weren't enough, they'd want a confession. And sometimes they had ways of encouraging you to talk. This brings us to a darker side of medieval justice: torture. Now, it is a common misconception that people were being stretched on the rack every single day for minor offenses. That's not quite true. Torture wasn't a free-for-all. It typically required legal permission and was reserved for very serious crimes, like treason, heresy, or murder, especially when the evidence was strong but a confession was needed to seal the deal. The idea was that physical pain would lead to the truth. Of course, we know now that people will say anything to make the pain stop, whether it's true or not, but in their eyes, it was a necessary tool for uncovering heinous plots against the king or the church. If there were no witnesses and no confession, they might turn to something called trial by ordeal. This is where things get really wild. The belief was that God would intervene to show who was innocent. You might have to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a few steps. Your hand would be bandaged, and if it healed cleanly after a few days, congratulations, God had declared you innocent. If it got infected and looked awful, well, you were guilty. Another common one was trial by water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty because the pure water was rejecting you. If you sank, you were innocent. The only problem was, you might drown before they could pull you out. It was a risky way to prove your point, to say the least. So, what happened once you were found guilty? The punishments were less about rehabilitation and more about sending a message. Justice wasn't just done. It had to be asterisk. Seen asterisk. Most punishments were public spectacles, designed for three main reasons. First, to scare everyone else into behaving. Seeing someone in the stocks, getting pelted with rotten vegetables, was a powerful reminder to follow the rules. Second, it was a raw display of power. The Lord, the King, the Church, they were showing everyone who was in charge and that breaking their laws had severe consequences. Finally, it was about maintaining social order. In a world without a strong central police force, these public displays helped keep the peace through fear and example. The punishments themselves ranged from fines and public shaming to brutal physical penalties. For a smaller crime, you might be put in the stocks or a pillory for a day, where you'd be a target for public ridicule. Flogging was also common. For more serious offenses, things escalated quickly. Mutilation wasn't unheard of. A thief might have a hand cut off, and for the worst crimes, like treason or murder, the death penalty was the ultimate answer. Hanging was the most common form of execution, and these events were major public gatherings. Entire towns would turn out to watch, treating it almost like a dark, green festival. It's easy for us to look back and judge this system as barbaric, and in many ways, it was. It relied on superstition, fear, and a legal process that was heavily stacked against the accused. But it also reflects the world they lived in, a world of deep religious faith, rigid social hierarchies, and a constant struggle to maintain order in the absence of the institutions we take for granted today. They were using the tools they had: faith, fear, and forced to build a system of justice they believed in. It's a fascinating and frankly terrifying look at how societies have tried to answer the fundamental question: what do we do when people do bad things? Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey into medieval justice interesting, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments which historical topic you'd like to see next. See you in the next video. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the dark and twisted world of medieval torture devices. You've probably seen them in movies or museums: the Iron Maiden, the rack, the pair of anguish. They're gruesome, terrifying, and have become symbols of a supposedly barbaric past. But what if I told you that many of these infamous devices never actually existed? Or at least, they weren't used in the way we think they were. It sounds crazy, I know, but a lot of what we believe about medieval torture is actually a collection of myths, exaggerations, and outright fabrications. So where do these stories come from? The answer is a bit surprising. A huge part of this myth-making machine cranked up during the 18th and 19th centuries, long after the Middle Ages were over. Let's start with one of the most iconic torture devices: The Iron Maiden. You know the one, a human-shaped sarcophagus lined with spikes, designed to slowly impale the victim locked inside? It's the stuff of nightmares, right? Well, it's also mostly just that. A nightmare. A piece of fiction. The first real account of an Iron Maiden comes from the late 1700s, from a philosopher named Johann Philipp. He wrote about the supposed execution of a coin forger back in 1515, but historical records from that time don't mention it at all. The first actual Iron Maiden to be constructed was built in the early 1800s for a museum display. It was created by piecing together various bits and pieces from different historical artifacts to create something that looked menacing and would attract a crowd. It worked. People were fascinated and horrified, and the legend of the Iron Maiden was born. From there, it just snowballed into a historical fact. So, why were people in the 18th and 19th centuries so obsessed with inventing and displaying these fake torture devices? It largely comes down to a change in thinking. This was the age of enlightenment. People saw themselves as rational, civilized, and progressive. To highlight just how far they'd come, they needed to paint the past, specifically the Middle Age, as a dark, superstitious, and brutal time. What better way to do that than by showcasing a chamber full of terrifying torture instruments? Museums became big business, and sensational exhibits drew in paying customers. A simple set of stocks was nearly as exciting as a spike-filled coffin or a bizarre contraption called the Spanish spider. These exhibits were less about historical accuracy and more about creating a thrilling, macabre spectacle. They were the horror movies of their day, and they sold a narrative of progress by contrasting their enlightened present with a fabricated, barbaric past. But museums weren't the only ones spinning these tales. Horror writers played a massive role too. Think about it. What is a gothic horror story without a creepy castle dungeon filled with instruments of pain? Writers like Edgar Allan Poe, with his classic story, The Pit and the Pendulum, took these ideas and ran with them, embedding them deep into our collective imagination. Poe's story features a giant, swinging blade descending on a helpless prisoner, a device for which there is absolutely no historical evidence, but it's an incredibly powerful and terrifying image, and it stuck. These writers weren't historians. They were entertainers. They needed to create suspense and terror. And what better source material than the supposed cruelty of the Spanish Inquisition or the dungeons of a medieval lord? The line between historical fact and thrilling fiction became hopelessly blurred. People read these stories, visited the sensationalized museum exhibits, and the myths became accepted as truth. So, the next time you see an Iron Maiden in a movie or a museum, remember its true origin story. It's not a genuine relic of medieval brutality, but a product of 19th century showmanship and gothic horror. It tells us less about the real Middle Ages and more about how later generations wanted to see themselves. History is often more complex and less sensational than the stories we tell about it. It's a fascinating look at how myths are made, sold, and eventually become part of our cultural memory. What other historical facts do you think might be more fiction than reality? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. See you next time. You've seen it in movies, video games, and even museums. The Iron Maiden. Just saying the name sends a shiver down your spine, right? It's the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. A human-shaped iron cabinet lined with terrifying spikes. The story goes that a person was forced inside. The doors were slowly closed, and the spikes would pierce their body, leading to a long, agonizing death. It is a truly horrifying image that has been burned into our collective consciousness as a fact of history. But what if I told you that this iconic torture device is a complete myth? That's right. Everything you think you know about the Iron Maiden is probably wrong. The idea that medieval lords and inquisitors used these monstrous contraptions to punish their enemies is a historical fabrication. So where did this gruesome legend come from? And why do we all believe it so strongly? Let's dig into the real story behind the Iron Maiden. To start, let's look at the historical records. When you search through genuine medieval documents, chronicles, and legal texts, you find absolutely zero mention of a device called an Iron Maiden. You'll find plenty of horrifying execution and torture methods. Don't get me wrong. The Middle Ages were a brutal time. But a spiked coffin? It's just not there. Historians have scoured the archives for centuries, and they've come up empty. Not a single credible account from the medieval period describes its use. So if it wasn't used in the Middle Ages, where did it come from? The first ever mention of something like an Iron Maiden appears much, much later. In the late 1700s, a writer named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote a story about a supposed execution in the 1500s. He described a machine with sharp blades that killed a coin forger. The problem is, he was likely embellishing history for dramatic effect, or just making it up entirely to create a thrilling story for his readers. It was the equivalent of a modern-day creepypasta, not a historical account. This fictional story sparked people's imaginations. It was just so gruesome and fascinating that it started to spread. But the real boom for the Iron Maiden came in the 19th century. This was a time when people were obsessed with the Dark Ages. There was a huge market for spooky, macabre tales and artifacts from the past. Entrepreneurs and showmen saw an opportunity. They started building their own Iron Maidens. Think of it like a business. They would take old cabinets, maybe some pieces of armor, and weld a bunch of spikes inside. They'd slap a scary face on the front and call it a genuine medieval torture device. These weren't historical artifacts. They were creative constructions, built specifically to be displayed in museums and traveling exhibitions, to shock and entertain a paying audience. One of the most famous examples, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, which heavily influenced our modern image of the device, was actually built in the early 1800s. It was a Frankenstein's monster of sorts, pieced together from various bits and pieces to look ancient and terrifying. It became a huge tourist attraction, and its fame spread across the world. Other museums saw its success and wanted their own, so more and more of these fakes were created. So, the Iron Maiden you see in a museum today is almost certainly not from the Middle Ages. It's a 19th century invention, a piece of historical fiction brought to life. It was designed to play on our fascination with the dark and brutal aspects of the past. It tells us more about the Victorians and their obsession with the medieval period than it does about actual medieval justice. It's a powerful reminder that history can be shaped and even invented. The image of the Iron Maiden is so strong that it has completely overshadowed the truth. It's a great story, but it's not real history. The real torture methods of the Middle Ages were certainly brutal, but the iconic Iron Maiden was not one of them. It's a ghost, a legend born from a single story and brought to life by 19th century showmanship. So next time you see an Iron Maiden in a movie or a museum, you'll know the secret. It's not a window into the medieval past, but a reflection of how easily myths can become accepted as fact. History is often more complex, and sometimes less cinematic than we think. Thanks so much for watching and exploring this fascinating piece of history with me. If you enjoyed debunking this myth, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments what other historical myths you'd like me to investigate. See you in the next video. You've definitely seen it in movies, video games, and maybe even a museum. The Iron Maiden, it's this terrifying, human-shaped sarcophagus, lined with razor-sharp spikes. The story goes that a victim was forced inside, the doors were slammed shut, and the spikes would slowly pierce their body, leading to an agonizing, drawn-out death. It's the very symbol of medieval cruelty, right? Well, what if I told you the whole thing is a giant historical hoax? That's right. The Iron Maiden is a myth. There is not a single credible historical record from the Middle Ages that mentions a device like this ever being used. No court documents, no chronicles, no first-hand accounts. Nothing. So where did this gruesome idea come from? The story first pops up in the late 1700s, hundreds of years after the medieval period ended. A historian named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote about the supposed execution of a coin forger in 1515, claiming he was put into a box with iron spikes. But here's the catch. Siebenkees seems to have made it all up, likely misinterpreting a mention of a mantle of shame, which was a barrow people were forced to wear for public humiliation, not for torture or execution. His story, however, was just too juicy to let go. It captured the public imagination. People in the 18th and 19th centuries were fascinated by the Dark Ages, and this tale fit perfectly with their vision of a barbaric, uncivilized past. This fascination led to a boom in collecting medieval artifacts, both real and fake. This is where the physical Iron Maidens we see today come from. They weren't discovered in some ancient castle dungeon. They were actually built in the 19th century. Museum curators and private collectors, eager to cash in on the public's obsession with medieval torture, started fabricating these devices. They would take old sarcophagi or cabinets, stick some spikes inside, and then spin a fantastic tale about their supposed history. One of the most famous examples, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was pieced together from various bits and pieces and put on display in the 1800s. It became a huge tourist attraction, but it was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid during World War II. Ones you see in museums today are mostly 19th century creations, or even modern replicas of those 19th century creations. So, why does this myth persist? For one, it's just a really compelling, horrifying image. It plays into our darkest fears and confirms our preconceived notions about the past. Movies and TV shows love using it because it is instantly recognizable as a symbol of extreme torture. It's a powerful piece of visual shorthand. But the reality is, while the Middle Ages certainly had its fair share of brutal punishments and torture methods, the Iron Maiden wasn't one of them. The story tells us more about the people of the 18th and 19th centuries, and their morbid curiosity than it does about actual medieval justice. It's a powerful reminder that history is often written and even built by the victors, or in this case, by some very creative storytellers and museum owners. So, the next time you see an Iron Maiden, remember, you're not looking at a genuine medieval torture device. You're looking at a piece of historical fiction, a prop from a story that was invented long after the knights and castles had faded away. It's a fascinating fake, a spooky legend, but not a historical fact. Thanks so much for watching and digging into this piece of history with me. If you enjoyed debunking this myth, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. See you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. When you think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Knight, castles, and maybe some seriously brutal torture devices. We've all seen them in movies and museums, terrifying contraptions that look like they were designed by a movie villain. But what if I told you that a lot of what we think we know about medieval torture is actually a myth? Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on some of the most infamous medieval devices and uncover the surprising truth. Get ready, because history is about to get a major fact. First up, let's talk about this Scold's bridle, also known as the Brank's bridle. You've probably seen images of this, a frightening metal mask, often with a spike or a plate designed to be forced into the mouth, supposedly to punish women for gossiping or nagging. It's a powerful and disturbing image, representing a cruel and misogynistic past. The story goes that a woman deemed too chatty would be forced to wear this humiliating device in public. It sounds like something straight out of the darkest parts of the medieval period, right? Well, here's the twist. While some simpler forms of public humiliation devices did exist, the horrifying, elaborate iron masks we often see are mostly fabrications from much later periods, specifically the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of the most extreme designs are pure fantasy, created to sell a sensationalized version of the past to museum goers and collectors. The idea of it being a widespread, common medieval punishment is largely inaccurate. The truth is, while the past had its share of cruelty, the Scold's bridle as a standard medieval tool of torture is more myth than reality. Next on our list is a device that looks just as terrifying as it sounds. The Judas cradle, or Judas chair. This was supposedly a pyramid-shaped seat on which a victim was slowly lowered by ropes. The sharp point was intended to cause unimaginable pain and injury. It's often presented as a pinnacle of Inquisition-era cruelty, a device used to extract confessions through sheer agony. It is a staple in many torture museums and has been featured in countless documentaries and TV shows, solidifying its place in our collective imagination as a genuine medieval nightmare. But once again, let's look at the historical evidence. When you dig into actual medieval records, manuscripts, and legal documents from the period, you find nothing. There's no credible historical proof that the Judas cradle ever existed in the Middle Ages. The earliest descriptions and illustrations of such a device actually date back to the 17th and 18th centuries, and many of the examples you see in museums today are modern reconstructions based on these later, often exaggerated, accounts. It was created as part of a later narrative to paint the Middle Ages as an unenlightened dark age, but as a real medieval tool. The evidence just isn't there. So, why do these myths persist? A big part of it comes from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when thinkers wanted to contrast their enlightened age with the supposedly barbaric and ignorant Middle Ages. Later, in the 19th century, there was a huge appetite for the Gothic and the macabre, leading to the creation of many of these fake torture devices for sensationalist exhibitions. They tell a good story, but it's not an accurate one. By debunking these myths, we get a more nuanced and truthful picture of the past. It's not about saying the Middle Ages were perfect, but about separating historical fact from lurid fiction. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into history's myths. If you found this as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical facts. Let me know in the comments which historical myth you want me to tackle next. Until then, stay curious.